Hello, Dr. Clavo. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for joining us on Marcy's Law's interview series, Why We Do What We Do, where we talk to people who are ambassadors for survivors and victims' rights throughout the country. And so many times, which is what leads to the naming of the series, Why We Do What We Do. There are stories that propel people to get into this work, like yourself. And more often than not, those stories start with a terrible tragedy. And yours is one of those stories. I want to start, though, by talking about how you are kind of a Wonder Woman. You have a doctorate in psychology, you have a master's in human services, you're a Navy veteran, you're a single mom, and you were just appointed a couple of years ago to head up the Sacramento, California Office of Violence Prevention. We are honored to have you as a guest and for you to take a little time out to tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are and why it is you do what you do to help survivors and families who go through tragedy and support them in ways that you were supported. So welcome, Dr. Clavo.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Now, one of the things that you and I talked about when we first started to get to know each other was how there really is no blueprint for how people react when something like happened to you happens. So I want to just bring you back to the date in November, when your son JJ Clavo was killed, November 13th, 2015. Could you could you tell us about that date? And before you do, um, because that was probably the worst moment that a mom could ever experience. Um, but I want you to tell us about at least one of your two best moments, because I know you had a daughter first. Tell us about when you became JJ's mom and the day he was born, and tell us a little bit about JJ, the boy, and the young man that he grew up to be.
It was I was what 25, 26 years old having my second child, and it was a boy. And I'm like, I'm having a boy, and I had a girl first, and my girl was just fabulous. This boy gave me problems from day one, that I found out I conceived him. I had a hard pregnancy. I was on bed rest most of it. The Navy sent me home, and I stayed home probably 7 of the 9 months. I didn't know I was pregnant for a few months with him. And so he came out. I mean, he was stubborn. Went in for an induction. So we had to take him out. And so handful from out the gate, but he was such a sweet and loving mama's boy. He was definitely a mama's boy. Always liked to laugh and play and joke around. We wrestled. I was a little tomboyish growing up. So, maybe I was supposed to have a man child because I wrestled with him. I played sports with him, and just trying to fill in those gaps and be that parent for him. But he was a boy. And so, I always expected for my kids to be a little mischievous. That's what kids do. I was. And so yeah, he was just a happy kid, spoiled. And yeah, so it was a joyous time. I mean, I didn't plan to have two kids, but I had two kids, and that was enough for me. That was enough.
And you were a little bit busy at the time. You were working as a labor negotiator for the peace officers union and for parole agents at the time. Is that right?
At the time of my son's death, that is correct.
Yeah. And how long did you work there?
I worked for CCPOA for 15 years.
And I want to now bring you to so your son JJ was also a great athlete. Turned out to be a real great high school football player.
Yes,
At which it was Grant Union High School.
that is correct.
And You were living in Sacramento, but you said you're a San Diego transplant.
I am a San Diego transplant. We all are. So we all started in San Diego. My kids were born there. And I was actually born on the Naval Air Station in Lemoore, California, right outside of Fresno, but grew up and spent my whole life in San Diego. Well, I won't say my whole life. I moved around a lot as a young adult
And
due to the
then,
Navy.
and you said you kind of run a multi-generational household.
I do. Oh
Yeah.
my God. So I have my parents who are 81 and 77. My mom has dementia. And then my daughter and my nephew that I raised. And so I have a house full of grown people that I care for. Cute big house. So I have in-law suite and stuff. So everybody kind of has their own autonomy and able to do what they do.
And so when your son JJ was a senior in high school, and now I'm not going to bring you back to November of 2015. They were just about to start the playoffs. It was a Friday night game, and you received a phone call, and you were getting ready to go to the game. You and your parents and your daughter, and a real exciting time.
Yes.
You told me how much you love going to those games, and then once the football playoffs start, it's you can barely get a seat at the stadium unless you get there on time or really early. And you received a phone call that you weren't sure if you were going to pick it up because you didn't recognize the number, but you picked it up anyways.
That is correct. So our Friday afternoons, I took every Friday off from work. So it was a given during football season. I would not be at work. Definitely a supportive sport mom. Love to go to sporting events with whichever one of my kids were playing at the time. And so that Friday was like any other Friday. We were all just waiting, exciting Friday because it was playoffs. And it was about 2:30, 2 something that afternoon. I received a call from a young man that went to school with my son, but I didn't recognize the number. And so I hesitated about answering the phone, and something told me to answer it. And when I answered the phone, the young man was like, Miss Nicole, JJ's been shot. And so it didn't really resonate as being something serious to me. And, my mind just did not go to the worst. I just kind of automatically was like, oh, okay, maybe he got grazed, it was a drive-by, maybe he got shot in the leg, maybe got shot in the arm, but everything would be okay. And so I, hung up the phone. I asked, where are you guys at? He says, we're at the football field. And I says, I'm on my way. Hung up the phone, screamed through the house, everybody throw some clothes on. JJ's been shot. We got to go. So as we're preparing, my phone rings again, and it's the young man again saying they're taking him to South Kaiser, which is great because I'm actually 16 plus miles from the school, and South Kaiser is probably about 8 miles or so from me. So half the distance at least. And so, I'm like, okay, I'm on my way. Then my phone rings again for the third time. And he says, no, they're not taking him there. They're going to take him to UC Davis. And I'm like, well, where are you guys at? And he's like, we're still at the school. Well, why are you there? Why are you still there? Because by this point, 10, 15 minutes had to have passed. And he says, well, they're working on him. And so at that moment, I'm like, this isn't something that's not serious. This is serious because why hadn't they left the school with my son? So so we sped to the hospital, and we sped to UC Davis, which is Midtown Sacramento. And it's not easy to get there from where I live because I'm in the county and out it's a good little distance to get to the freeway, and the streets are, full of lights. So we took the streets because it was traffic hour at this point, and ran many lights. You would have thought we were going code 3 in our own ambulance, and got to the hospital. And as the ambulance there was an ambulance driving in as we were driving in. And I told my daughter in that moment, if my son is in that ambulance, he is no longer with us, just because it just was like it was just going so slow. So upon our arrival, anyone who's familiar with gunshot victims or whatnot, they won't really tell you whether the person is in the hospital or not. So when we got there, I asked the front desk, I told them who I was, and they, just told me to have a seat, but they never confirmed whether he was there or not. Then a few minutes passed by, and one of the social workers come out and, ask if I was his mom. And, my daughter and I are standing there, and my parents and nephew are in the lobby. And I say yes. And she's like, well, can we go in this little room? And I'm like, absolutely not. I don't want to go in the little room. I just need to know whether my son is alive or not. And so she kept trying to get me in the room. And my daughter was like, just tell her, just tell her. And she told me that unfortunately my son had passed away. So in that moment, Peter, I, kind of took a deep breath. I walked outside, belted out a scream and said, no parent is supposed to bury their child. Walked back in, got my parents, asked the social worker, can I see my son? Can I at least see him? And she says, well, let me go ask. And she comes back and she says, no. And I'm like, no. And she's like, well, he's evidence. So in that moment, I felt as if they had objectified my child, my son, my baby, part of my soul. And he was no longer looked at as a human being or my child. He was now evidence. And so that was probably the worst moment for me in those moments, is that I couldn't see him while the blood was still running warm through his body. And it wasn't until 3 weeks later that I was able to actually see him.
And I remember when you and I were first talking about this, you thought to yourself that you were going to need to make a conscious decision of whether or not you were going to be a victim or a survivor. And you chose the latter, said, I'm going to be a survivor and I'm going to triumph. And what you did from that moment on, after you were able to make that decision and find some clarity and as much inner peace as you could, seems as though from that moment on, you moved forward and did the best you can to turn that pain into some kind of purpose, into some kind of support, not just for yourself, but ultimately for others. In fact, as soon as I think it was a day later, or at least within the next few days, you went to the school to talk to the other families, to try to help them manage their loss of your son. Tell us a little bit about what you did there.
Oh, yes, there was my faith is very, very strong, and God is my director. I believe in him chartering my steps. And so I believe in those moments, my steps was chartered for me. Less than 24 hours later, my son died around 3 o'clock between 2:30 and 3 o'clock that afternoon. And 10 o'clock the next morning, I was standing in the cafeteria of the high school. When my son was killed, there were 4 other young men in his vehicle with him. And so the lives that were impacted personally was tremendous. You're talking about 16, 17-year-old men who witnessed their best friend, their brother, their teammate be gunned down and murdered, all in a vehicle with them. And it could have possibly been them at the same time. And so in those moments when I left that hospital, I definitely had to make a decision on whether or not I was going to succumb to this or survive it. I chose to survive it. And so at 10 o'clock that next morning, the school called a meeting with all of the parents and the players and community was there. And so I felt the need to be there as well. They didn't know I was coming. I came unannounced, and I showed up. And so I just needed to speak life into those kids. I needed to speak life into those parents, because these kids never imagined that they would experience this level of trauma their senior and junior years of high school. And so I needed them to understand that they needed to live not only for themselves, but for JJ as well. And that the parents needed to be there to support their kids. They needed to be there to support them through this trying time. This was November, and they had still 4 or 5 months left of school left. And they needed to continue to live. They just needed to continue to breathe. And that day started my new life. That was the jump start to who I am today. That was the jump start of my advocacy for youth and community being reborn, because I'd come from that type of advocacy, but it had been years. You know, I had walked away from that. And I think God kind of shook me and said, get back to where I originally directed you to. You've been running, and now's your time. And so I listened, and I took those orders seriously. And I've been working in that field of advocacy for our underserved communities, our Black and brown kids who face gun violence, gang violence, and trauma more frequently than others. And I take it seriously.
Well, when you said that people were surprised that you showed up that next morning for that gathering, I think your presence alone really was something that was resonant with the rest of the community, because I'm sure that they looked, whether it was the kids, his teammates, his classmates, or the other parents and the other moms, looked to you, and they probably said to themselves at that moment, and when they went home, if she can do it, I can do it. And I think that has, I know that has continued, because you've told me a little bit about what you've done since then. You had the help of your daughter to start the Healing Five Foundation at the time, because you were telling me that the outpouring of support was incredible, and people started to send money, which was great. And then they started to send more money, and you said, well, we need to try to help other people. So let's do something. So you started the Healing Five Foundation, and you know, some of the five kind of tenets of it are to encourage, acknowledge, motivate, empower, and educate. You were telling me how your daughter was a great support system for you, and I'm sure you were for her. But then the two of you became a force to try to help other grieving families that were experiencing tragedies like yours. Could you tell us a little bit about Healing Five and what you did, and when you started that?
Well, as you were saying, so it seemed like hours to days after the school had received envelopes of money, cards from all over the state. High schools had put briefs outside of their schools for my son, Merced. I mean, it was just a plethora of schools and cities and organizations that supported. I got checks in the mail to my house. People looked me up and sent me letters of encouragement. And, you know, it was a high profile shooting. And you know, the Marcus Cousins, you know, paid for my son's funeral. At the time, he was playing for the Kings, Sacramento Kings. He had came to Grant quite a few times. He kind of hung out there with the kids and things, and had met my son. And I didn't need the money, and I didn't want to just be taking the money to take the money. So my daughter and my daughter was 6 years older than my son. So at the time she was 23 and he was 17. And so she was in her last year at Sac State. She was graduating that year that he was killed. And so at the time we sat and, we kind of, what should we do? Because of the outpouring of support, I knew that there had been mothers before me, families before me, grandparents, friends, loved ones who had not received the amount of support that I received. And you heard it through the streets. You heard a lot of the enviousness, why her son this, why her son that. And so you deal with a lot of that even during this type of tragic event in your life. And so we decided to create the Healing Five Foundation. The five represents that my son was the fifth grandson, was the fifth grandchild. His football number was number 5. My daughter's birthday is 5/5. He was born the 5th month. My birthday's the 15th. So 5 just resonated. We love the number 5. So it was like a family crest, right? And so that Healing Five was only fitting. That, we wanted to heal people. We wanted it to be representative of who we were, and 5 just fit. So with that, we began the organization. I held conferences, I held breakfast. The very first one was here at my home. And I had probably 10 to 15 mothers and fathers and siblings. It was important that my daughter was a part of this organization because oftentimes in times like this, siblings are left out. So it would be many days that we would be somewhere, or, we're at an event, or we're at a conference, or, some type of healing circle. And they always asked her if she was taking care of me. They never asked who was taking care of her. So it was important that we were able to create something that not only looked into the adult family members, but the young adult family members, the siblings and close relatives that may have been, raised as siblings with the loved one that passed. We would hold breakfasts, and I would have the victims advocates there. I would have detectives there. I would have media there, because I needed these families to have the access to these individuals that I had, to be able to get answers, to be able to ask questions, and figure out how to advocate for themselves. For Sacramento, I was probably the loudest voice of a mom that they had ever seen. And so with that, I was like the media spokesperson for mothers and families throughout the city, used by the mayor, the council, other organizations and families alike. And I needed families to feel okay about speaking up and writing the narrative and not having the narrative written for them. I needed them to feel comfortable with that and understand. On the flip side, I needed the detectives and the media to understand how to approach us in those moments. The first news person that showed up at my door was Tom Miller from KCR3 at the time. He's no longer in California, but he's still in the media. He's still on the news. So he walked up to my door and rang my doorbell, and this was less than 24 hours later, and wanted to do an interview. And I was like, why are you here? How did you get my address? I'm just oblivious in this moment. I'm like, no one knows where I live. I live a pretty private life. Why are you at my door? And, I kind of closed the door on him. And in those moments, as he was walking away and I was walking away, something told me to go back to that door and open it. And I did. And I invited him in, because in that moment, I knew I had to be the one to write the narrative. I needed to be the one to tell the story of my son, my son, JJ. And that was what I needed to teach through Healing Five, these families. I needed to teach them how to deal with that. And then, for the detectives, that part was that there's oftentimes in these situations that you come across families and they're upset, they're angry, they're in a black space, they're not seeing clearly. And sometimes, it comes out being belligerent, sometimes we're not the nicest people to meet in those moments. And so sometimes detectives get turned off by that. Sometimes they don't, know how to bounce back emotionally from being cursed out. And so I need them to understand that don't hold that against the victim's family in those moments, because they're not themselves. And that's just a temporarily moment in their lives. And that shouldn't weigh in on how you treat them moving forward or how you treat their case.
Yeah, and you made a very strong a point of saying to me that the DA's office and the police, when all was said and done, and the investigators and the victim witness advocates were absolutely phenomenal. And the relationship that you had, and one of the things, what the reason Marsy's Law even began was to give victims and victims' families meaningful and enforceable constitutional rights as victims. And Marsy's Law actually started in your state, in California.
Yes.
And it was just great to hear how you told me how they had made you aware, meaning everyone in the district attorney's office and law enforcement made you aware of your constitutional rights under Marsy's Law, and how it helped you to be a real part of the investigation, of the court system, of the trial, and even since then for all the hearings that you're notified, and you're a participant, and you're an active participant, and that's really the way that it should be, which is really the reason why Marsy's Law was started and exists, and why we continue to work throughout the different states to try to get meaningful and enforceable constitutional rights for victims throughout the country. Now, I want to get a little bit back to what you have done, what you did as an advocate yourself. I know that one of the things that you did was you raised scholarship money to try to help kids get to college. You talked about how you organize support groups for parents, and how you still do. How there's really kind of no. I remember you were telling me that there's kind of no job description for what you do, because in the office, you don't just sit in an office. You actually go out to crime scenes. You actually see different organizations, and these organizations that are looking for funding. You say, well, I'd like to see what they do.
Yes.
And so you're actually out at crime scenes, so you kind of almost never sleep. And I remember you were telling me about the Parents of Murdered Children conference that you went to. You didn't say anything about it because you're too humble, but I found out that you also raised money for at least 8 parents for their hotel, for their registration fees, for breakfast vouchers, so that they could attend the Parents of Murdered Children conference, because you knew how important it was to their healing and moving forward. And Chief Hahn, sometimes, God drops these guardian angels into our lives, and you and I were talking about how all the prosecutors and the police, and in particular Chief Hahn, was really helpful, and actually was the one that actually encouraged you to go into the position where you are now. Chief Hahn said that it's almost not even a community event unless Dr. Clavo is there, because he says that he has not been to a community event that he doesn't see Nicole Clavo at the community event, trying to help people, and specifically trying to help victims and survivors. Before we, you've been so generous with your time, but before we wrap up, there was one story that I saw, if you would be kind enough to share it with us, how during one of these conferences, you actually ran into a woman who was a police officer, and she happened to be the first police officer on the scene when JJ was murdered. And
You're trying to make me cry, Peter.
um,
Yes.
she talked to him, and that was important to you. Could you just tell us a little bit about how that conversation went, and how that touched you, made you feel a little bit more complete?
Oftentimes we always wonder, we feel like, not we, I speak for I felt as if I failed him because I wasn't there in those final moments, right? And so not being there in those final moments, as a mom, I created my own storyline. I created my own visual video of my son dying. And I didn't have answers, because I wasn't there. And so when I met her and she told me she was there in those final moments, and she described those final moments, I felt the pain in her. That was one of the most traumatic moments in her policing career. She prayed with my son. She sat with my son. She held his hand. She told him it would be okay, that it's all right in his final moments. They declared my son dead at the hospital, but I'm more than positive he died at the school. And in those moments, knowing that she was there, I will be forever grateful for her coming to me and sharing those moments with me. No one should have to witness that. She has kids, I know only as a mom how painful that has to be, having that memory of a young man dying right there, beside you. So I tell you, Sacramento PD, Sacramento District Attorney's Office owes me nothing. They absolutely owe me nothing. They worked tirelessly on this case. They've all become friends. They have my cell, I have their cell. We still use each other for business going forward. We each play a role in our daily work lives. I can call them and be like, let's go to lunch, and they truly owe me nothing. They did a great job. It's just my job to ensure that they continue to do great jobs, a great job as we move forward in more events that are going to take place like this. There's going to be more tragic events, unfortunately. And just, it's my job to make sure that they continue to do the work that they do at the level that they do it at.
Yeah, it was just amazing to see how when I saw that you described how that JJ was shown the love by this police officer that you would have wanted to show to him had you been there yourself.
Yes.
Um, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your story with us and for sharing your example, because that is how this work continues to get done. Because people who are looking to try to figure out what they're going to do with their life, what their purpose might be, they see someone like you, they see your strength, and they see how worthwhile it is to help somebody and to help victims and to help families. It's a job that no one ever wants to get into the way that you had to get into it. But it is so inspiring for people to see. We are so blessed that, as you say, God charters your steps, that God did charter your steps in the way that you continue to move, in the direction that you continue to step. So we're grateful at Marsy's Law for the work that you do. I'm grateful that you were able to share it with us today, and we will stay in touch too.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
Thanks so much, Dr. Clavo.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
You too.